Hello, I'm Alan Davies. I'm an architect and heritage lead at BDP. Welcome to the first ever BDP podcast series. It's called Old Buildings, New Beginnings. In this series, we discuss the current thinking relating to the reuse of old and existing buildings. We will discuss topics including adaptive reuse, sustainability, accessibility, improving performance, as well as the cultural significance of keeping old buildings. Why build new when you can repurpose the old? Welcome to the conversation. So welcome to Old Buildings, New Beginnings, where this week we're considering how we as architects bring buildings back to life. We live in a time of change, and the global pandemic has accelerated that change. As we emerge from the pandemic, we need to adapt, and our buildings will also adapt. From adaptive reuse of historic structures to retrofit projects in modern buildings, there are more options available to us and to our clients than ever before. Retrofit and refurbishment seems like the obvious choice, but is it more cost effective? And can we deal with historic buildings with heritage value? Can we retain the important character and history of these buildings? With me today, I have three architect directors whose work involves in adaptive reuse. Firstly, Dev Mehta at BDP in the Toronto studio, Bruce Kennedy in our Glasgow studio, and Mike Camden in the Manchester studio. Welcome to you all. Mike, it sounds as if the drivers for change in education are changing almost before your very eyes. The pandemic has changed the education sector. Can you just tell us a bit about that and how the needs of the universities are changing?
I can do my best, yeah. So as an education sector, we're looking at a lot of campuses that were built in a lot in the kind of late 60s, early 70s, when there's a real boom in education in the UK. And many of the campuses are now finding that their building stock is tired, in need of a physical kind of upgrade, because buildings, the facades, the infrastructure are just tiring. But also things have just really moved on. Requirements of a 21st century education facility is generally quite different, probably was in the 1970s. So one of the buildings we've completed recently is refurbishment to the old Students' Union at Manchester Metropolitan University, and its conversion into a new Institute of Sport, so a research and teaching building. It's quite interesting looking at the old building that it was in its day, it was incredibly successful as a students' union, really kind of strong list of bands who played there, everything from U2 through to the Cure, Simple Minds to Nirvana, probably some of the more famous ones from the late through the 80s. But much of it didn't work. I mean, things like the bar and the dance floor were up on the first floor. So as various regulations around sort of fire requirements, etc., changed, it just became more and more difficult for the university to operate. Plus, I think the whole requirement around what the university was wanting out of a students' union has shifted in the 50 years since it was built. So we initially, the building was earmarked for demolition. It's in quite a kind of a key point within the city on Manchester's Oxford Road Knowledge Corridor. But the university asked us to do a number of feasibility studies to look at it and say, well, what else could it be? How else could you bring it back to use? Can we get some more life out of it? So ultimately, we looked at some studies. We looked at how we could fit the brief for a sports research institute into there, and developed a strategy for how it could work, looked at it, and the benefits from both a cost point, but also from a carbon saving were really significant by retaining as much of the existing concrete frame, some of the cladding as possible, but really breathing kind of new life into it and getting it to work and giving the building probably another 50 years worth of life. I think the universities were changing steadily already with the advent of fees in the UK going back a few years now. Then students started becoming a lot more discerning about what they were getting out of their education and therefore what they wanted their facilities to provide. But I think one thing that's been really accelerated by the pandemic is the shift away from the reliance on sort of didactic lectures to transmit a huge amount of education through towards having much more space for students to be involved in self-directed learning, social learning, and much more active learning, proactive learning than many institutes could previously provide. So I think what we're seeing is a real shift in terms of increase in spaces that were sort of the in-between spaces. So they're no longer just about sort of formal learning spaces or formal labs. It's a real growth in spaces for students to inhabit between lab sessions, between lectures, but also going into the evening and to really kind of colonize, to make their own, and to use where they can work in many ways as kind of a student office, I guess, rather than taking work back to their bedsits or their halls of residence. So one of the challenges is to say, well, how can we kind of get that space in? And I think it was accelerated by the pandemic for a couple of reasons. When it demonstrated to universities that shifting lectures online can be very successful. There is success stories. There's some institutions which found that a lot harder. But what it does, it gives students a real opportunity to kind of go back and revisit lectures kind of on and off. But therefore, it does question whether the live lecture in a big lecture theatre is always needed, or whether there's a better way of doing it. But actually, if students are therefore able to access a lecture off-site and remotely at any time of day or night, why should they come to campus? So therefore, creating facilities that really bring them to campus and make them want to spend time on campus, because those people-to-people skills are really important, both for their learning but also for their future employability, is really key. So how can we do that? How can we create spaces? And in many ways, I think revitalizing existing buildings, because of some of the the cost benefits and the carbon benefits, is an effective way of producing that new type of space.
And Bruce, in contrast, I think the drivers are cultural drivers and the combination of those and technical issues.
Yes, hi Alan. I think the first project I'd like to talk about is Aberdeen Music Hall. I think certainly the cultural drivers were really important to the client, and they were very much in the forefront of our minds as we approached the project. Because I think what they were tending to find is for very many types of performance, they had a dwindling audience. The venue itself, I think, felt as if it was probably stuck in the mid-20th century in terms of its presentation, its sort of look and feel, and its ambience. And their cafe takings were down. It was more difficult to be able to stage the types of performance that they wanted in the main spaces. So very much it was about bringing in new audiences, making the building much more accessible to a much wider cross-section of the community, whether that be younger people or middle-aged people, but, just spreading out that accessibility, culturally and socially as much as physically. And there was certainly a physical accessibility issue, which is also very common to heritage buildings, in that many of them were designed at a time when issues about physical accessibility were, certainly not in the forefront of people's minds. But now, of course, we want buildings to be as inclusive as they possibly can. And again, the adaptation of heritage structures in a way that's sympathetic in order to ensure that you're providing the maximum accessibility is absolutely key in these projects. So physical accessibility, cultural and social accessibility, kind of hand in hand, certainly on that project. And actually thinking about another project that we've dealt with recently in Glasgow at Queen Street Station, we had a fantastic opportunity there to have a grade, or I should say a category A listed building at the heart of the project, which is the original train shed that was designed by James Carswell in the middle of the 19th century. So an A-listed structure is effectively the highest listing value in Scotland, and it's seen as a nationally important structure, single span iron train shed. Fantastic building, so in volume. And the good thing about it is it's still serving the same function that it did when it was first built, which is always fantastic actually in buildings. So still very relevant, 100, 150 years on, 170 years on. And what we did there, of course, was to respond to, again, change in the railway environment. So a push toward decarbonisation, a push toward accommodating more passengers on the railways. And of course, this was all pre-COVID. Because of course, we're all hoping and expecting that there'll be a robust return to public transport as people become more confident again. But there was an increase in passenger numbers forecast from about 19 million to about 38 million per annum by 2042. And so the challenge there was to get longer trains into the station. And in order to do that, actually what had to happen was the platforms had to be extended. And that pushed the public concourse out of the James Carswell train shed and toward the street to the south. So our challenge became, how do you then replace that passenger concourse? And we went through a lot of analysis, pedestrian flow analysis and so on to determine the best form and location for that. And that allowed us to make a justified case for the removal of some fairly unattractive 1960s and 70s buildings that certainly had no heritage value and were pretty much unloved by the people of Glasgow. And what that allowed us to do then was put a big glazed frontage. Effectively, the station concourse became a big living room in the street, which also then addresses the principal public space in Glasgow George Square, the principal civic space. So suddenly the station was opened up to the city and the city to the station, which is a fantastic experience. So now when you come off the train from Edinburgh or from the Highlands, rather than your first impression of Glasgow being Burger King that you see at the end of the concourse, you're now looking out into George Square and the civic buildings beyond. So it's really been a fantastic transformation. And of course, the new building is designed as an entirely contemporary expression. But what we were able to do as part of that was also strip away all of the accretions that had happened to the A-listed train shed over the years and reveal its original structure and its original integrity by making it virtually freestanding, surrounded by a new building. So a big driver for that was understanding the history of the site and understanding the nature and the integrity of the original building, and then trying to reinforce that with the setting that we created with our new contemporary building.
Great. Dev, if I can bring you back to the drivers, it sounds as if the drivers are structural changes, economic changes, industries declining, industries starting, which we've seen a lot in the UK in the latter part of the 20th century. Is that a significant driver in other projects in Canada, or what else do you see as the main drivers for change, which may bring about adaptive reuse?
Yeah, I think there are a number of drivers. Industry change, certainly. We have over the decades converted a number of factory buildings, toy factory, candy factory in downtown Toronto, and of course the shoe factory buildings that have kind of run their life, but offer extremely flexible plans and structure that can be reused, I'd say, quite easily, in a sense. So that's certainly a bit of it. I would say, looking ahead, one of the big changes that we will see will be, I think, a combination of our kind of importance on understanding the different aspects of sustainability, the main item being embodied carbon, and understanding, there's this saying that the most sustainable buildings are the ones that already exist, of course. So reusing significant elements and components of existing buildings, I think, will be more appealing, but will also likely be required as policies shift to understand embodied carbon. So I think that's going to be a very huge component. When thinking about the Bata shoe factory in particular, really what was maintained was the concrete structure of the building, but it's a significant amount of embodied carbon. And I think looking ahead, speaking from a North American perspective, so much of what we built is tailored to automobiles, the storage of automobiles, for example. I mean, you think of the average, let's say, new high-density multi-unit residential building in an urban center. For every, let's say on average, for every one residential unit, you have one parking space that's built, and as the units continue to shrink for affordability and for various reasons, the parking space doesn't shrink, given the configuration and size of a car. So, you're looking at roughly 300 to 350 square feet, or about 30 square meters dedicated to a parking space. And in the future, for a number of reasons, I think we can assume that private automobile usage will dwindle. And so I think looking ahead, we really have to carefully consider what we do with all of these either below grade or above grade parking structures that are largely built out of cast in place concrete and have tremendous embodied carbon in them. So I think that will be a big challenge, but a great opportunity.
Yeah, I think there's two really interesting points there, Dev's coming that overlap with what we're looking at as well. I mean, the first is very much about the low carbon design. That for clients that already own a lot of buildings, then that is a massive consideration. Can they start off by not demolishing something, and how much of something can they retain? And I know on the Institute of Sport we retained all of the structure, and we retained the facades to the north elevation, partly because it's very difficult to build against a motorway and just overclad it. But the analysis suggests we've saved the equivalent carbon to running the new building for 12 years. So that's quite a notable benefit, I think. Out of if we designed it to a 50-year life, then nearly 25% of the building's running cost is already absorbed just by saving the facade. Saving the structure with some of the facade. And I think for major landowners, we're going to see that as a growing consideration, and analysis, and testing to be done right from day one to say, what are the benefits of keeping this?
I think it'll be interesting to see. I think it'll be interesting to see in the future if the legislative framework begins to catch up with us as well, and there's actually a positive pressure in favour of retention, as opposed to the assumption of development is that it's an open field. You can either, if it's not a listed or a heritage building, and very many of the structures we deal with are not listed buildings, but it doesn't mean to say they don't have value nonetheless.
Yeah. That's a very interesting metric, which would be useful to repeat for any 20th century building retained. I'm interested, Dev, in the use made of the industrial factory itself. You mentioned the overall setting and the opportunities there for an attractive environment, but the industrial building itself was converted to what uses?
Largely, actually, to residential, and in the factory buildings we've converted over the years, they are primarily converted to residential. They offer expansive, floor-to-ceiling heights, massive open windows, and spaces that simply would not be built in conventional kind of construction methodologies, and offer really unique and spectacular spaces.
So space standards are more generous than new build, I guess. Are there any other advantages that you can see from reuse? This is an open question to all three of you. Any other advantages apart from sustainability we've discussed, space standards, from reusing buildings rather than building new?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the nature of the structure, but very many buildings we deal with, and it's particularly maybe the case in the case of public buildings, are also a repository of memory for people. So I think they create a place in society that gives identity and a sense of place. In the case of a building like the music hall, perhaps that's a more obvious analogy in the sense that Many people maybe met there, had their first kiss, maybe went to the first dance, enjoyed a particular concert that sits with them forever, So these buildings are really important, I think, to society. And, we have a responsibility in the way that we deal with those to recognise that, as architects, we don't own those buildings to do with as we want. They're actually owned by the wider community. And we have a part to play in their redevelopment, but, it's not entirely in our gift to decide what's appropriate. I think that's an important aspect of it for sure.
Well, this touches on issues of significance, what we generally, when we talk in heritage terms, as significance. And there are various ways of measuring heritage significance. And in UK guidance and legislation, there are 4 values discussed, which are aesthetic or architectural, historic, evidential, what it tells us about the way people lived, and community value. And I think you've touched on, in particular there, on community value. And I guess, Michael would say the same for his MMU building and the bands that played there. That the community that related to was students of a certain period or throughout an extended period. In Dev's case, the people who actually emigrated and set up that place, and then their descendants after that. So the significance. I think it'd be interesting now to discuss how we retain that character, or how you've retained that character or that memory in the buildings that you've worked on. If I could, I'll come back to you, Dev. I think there is in converting, and it's quite a bold conversion from a big, expansive space to residential. But I guess it just serves a bigger community now. And are there any particular ways that you've sought to retain that character, or do you think it's inherent in the architecture and the architecture is strong enough?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. When thinking about the factory building itself, about a shoe factory, when we demolished essentially all the exterior, interior components and retained the concrete structure, which is a very simple. I mean, it's vertical, circular columns with essentially like a hollow core cast in place slab. You think it's really open to do whatever you want with it. However, architecturally, every design move we made was so prescribed by the existing structure, and it informed every single thing we did to the smallest detail. So, and I'll give you one example. In converting to residential, a big addition to the building was installing new balconies onto the exterior, which were foreign elements to the building. And a factory building wouldn't have balconies. And the easy thing to do would be to bolt steel cantilevered members to the columns that are expressed on the outside of the building. As we kind of drew that up, and we were working very closely with the late Sonia Bata, who we called Mrs. Bata, and we showed her the sketch, and we knew immediately it just felt wrong. It wasn't the right thing to do because the vertical columns were such an important expression on the exterior of the building. So we really had to think creatively about how to add a balcony to this building that really responded to the character of the existing building. So we had to carefully kind of insert these steel members that cantilevered from the inside of the floor structure, and had a precast balcony piece that had shared the exact same depth and kind of proportions of the beams on the exterior, and all these kind of nuanced details. It was a very, very complicated kind of surgical thing to do on the building. It looks very seamless though in how it was integrated into the look of the building, but there's really, thinking back on it, no other way we could have done that. And what it does is it creates these very kind of bespoke details. You couldn't take that balcony and put it on any other building. And I think the act of working with existing buildings just forces you to respond to the existing building in unique ways.
Yeah, that's a very specific architectural response, which is worthy of any listed building. I forget if you said that it's scheduled in any way, but the approach is clearly one that applies to listed buildings. Bruce, in terms of keeping that memory of youth and culture, was there any way that you were able, apart from preserving the building, conserving the building, keeping it in use, were there any specific moves in terms of referencing that earlier life?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you approach an existing structure, and particularly a scheduled or listed structure, it's really important to do some research and really understand what the building's about, understand what it's about in its context historically, and understand what it means to people today. And we were fortunate, certainly in Aberdeen, for instance, which is the project I mentioned earlier, that the client had already done quite a bit of work in the run-up to the project happening. So they had already surveyed audiences to find out what they thought was good, what was bad about the building. As they began to approach construction, as we were still designing, they were beginning to gather information from members of the public and people who had used the buildings over years. So that would include photographs of, their granny at a dance in the 1920s or whatever it may be, or photos of them in the 1970s at a rock concert. So, they were beginning already to gather this big repository of, what does the building actually mean to the people of Aberdeen? And I think for us that was really important, was to understand that link to the past and to ensure that what we did with the building left a legacy that was still incredibly recognisable to people, that they didn't come back and felt that their connection with the building had been lost. And I think a lot of that's about articulation, which is obviously a really important principle, I think, as well in the approach to the design of listed buildings. So where there was something that was good, that had integrity, that had historic heritage value, then obviously we were very careful to preserve that, to set it appropriately, and then by the interventions that we made to give that a new setting that really revealed it, whether that be through architectural lighting, even just things as simple as picking an appropriate colour scheme of the juxtaposition of new and old elements, that, these elements of the heritage building maybe were revealed to people in a slightly different way that gave them a new perspective, I think, on something they'd been used to seeing perhaps for years. And I think that was well received when the building reopened. People came in and saw it with fresh eyes, but still felt connected to it, still felt it was the place they knew and loved.
I guess when we come to yours, Mike, there are fewer constraints. The building that you described is not listed. Is it more a matter of moving it on and for the architecture to evolve to meet the current drivers, or is there still an effort to retain that memory of what's happened there before?
Well, some of it's about memory, but some of it is about, I think, looking at these buildings and thinking physically, what opportunities can they create that you wouldn't necessarily have if you were building a particular brief from scratch. So for instance, at the former Students' Union at Manchester Met, we had the dance floor as a double height space right within the middle of the brief of the building. What could we do with it? So we looked quite hard at the brief, at some of the labs. We tried to analyse what the brief needed, what they wanted to do that may actually benefit from that, and ultimately they had a biomechanics lab that always wanted to be able to move vertically through space rather than just across four plates in the floor, actually move up steps across beams and see how people analyze how people moved vertically. So looking at this double height space, all of a sudden we could create this double height lab for them for zero extra cost because it was there, but it enabled the brief to expand and really offered a new way of looking at the activities that could take place. Similarly, the outside of the building was previously full of a whole series of external steps, terraces, balconies, which were a headache. They were very difficult to maintain. They generally leaked because there was just so many different interfaces. So one of the things that the university were keen to not retain in the existing building was those, and we were asked to kind of look at how we could get rid of them. But rather than getting rid of them, what we ultimately did was we expanded the facade and the envelope around them to internalize these various steps. And then they became some of the self-directed learning spaces. So again, you've got essentially a series of free double height spaces, atria, which overlap, they looked into each other, and it created a really nice set of internal arrangements that joined the whole building back together as in a really kind of cohesive way.
And I guess a level of richness that you wouldn't get in a new building.
Yes, because I think it would be difficult and expensive to design those things into a new building. But by looking innovatively and creatively at what the constraints that are already there, how can you really kind of flip that round to create exciting new opportunities?
And I guess it's a case of how buildings can learn, how buildings can change and adapt and become better at meeting needs over time. And being able to recycle them in that way is an excellent.
I think that response to constraints point that you made, Mike's a really good one as well, actually, because people often think that, an architect's dream project's a blank sheet of paper, some unconstrained site with a brief where you can go and form whatever you want. But actually, in many ways, the richest projects are those where there's something to respond to, which is why we spend so much time looking at site analysis and really trying to understand in depth, what the properties and the constraints of sites are. And where there's an existing structure, that's even more the case. And I think it's what you do creatively with the constraints that are there that really generates a stronger idea. And I think that's one of the joys of working on projects that involve heritage or existing structures, that you already have, something as a springboard to respond to and to create a dialogue with.
Yeah, and I think those constraints can really drive innovation as well. We put labs into the existing building, and at a glance, you'd say the floor-to-floor heights aren't enough. But by looking, enough for kind of the services that are required for a contemporary lab, whether it's air handling services or gases or various things, generally drive a much greater floor-to-floor height than this building had. But so what we tried to do there was turn that through 90 degrees and have sort of a service wall, so that rather than going out at the top of rooms, we went out at the back with air handling services. But that also meant that we had much shorter duct runs. We saved money in all those ducts, those services. We saved money in what the height of the building would be against a kind of a new building. But all of that was innovation because of the constraints. And I think that's quite exciting to be able to do, rather than just deliver what is considered, I suppose, the best practice solution at any particular time.
So what we're getting is a picture of how reusing buildings can add richness and variety and layering of meaning and a patina to existing buildings. I think if we can finish by just discussing what our architectural approaches is, and I think I know the answer to this, but Dev has already touched on the care needed in dealing with existing buildings. We have a tradition in BDP and more widely of constructive conservation, of clearly articulating new interventions. That is still the prevailing approach to dealing with old buildings, historic buildings. Is there anything you can add to that in terms of the architectural aspects of layering on new aspects to a building, or alternatively not mimicking or the sort of what is generally regarded as pastiche?
Yeah, I think be bold is the statement, to be honest. Bold but sensitive, because we are dealing with buildings that are, particularly of historic value. But it's interesting that very often the interventions that we reverse in buildings that have historic value that we come to now are the ones that have been made maybe in the last 40 or 50 years. And they're often the ones that are actually trying to mimic the past, the ones that, pretend that, that Victorian building always had a plant room or whatever it may be, and try to disguise the intervention that's been made. I think that's generally always a mistake. I think it's better to build something of its time. I mean, very often the buildings we're dealing with are the survivors of a period when probably most of their contemporaries have been demolished, because they are amongst the best examples and the most robust examples of their type. And that's often the case because the original architects and the people that conceived them were bold in their vision when they created these buildings. And I think we shouldn't shy away from being bold in our vision for them as well when we come to transform them. And it's not to say that, I'm advocating a move back to maybe the 1960s and 70s when a slightly more brutalist approach was taken that, began to ignore the cultural context of heritage buildings. That certainly wouldn't be an appropriate route to go down. But I think neither was the kind of 1980s and certainly early 90s approach of trying to be so polite and deferential that actually you end up with things that are a horrible prestige very often. I think interventions want to be of their time very much as the original buildings were of their time. And I think that's the most successful expression of any age.
And I guess, Mike, and Dev, in terms of 20th century buildings, you can be bold. There is a boldness about 20th century buildings that we work on, which is refreshing to work on.
There is, but I think also with the narrative moving on around the carbon argument, what we consider of value is also moving on. It's not necessarily because it is a particularly good example. It can be of value simply because it's there, because you've got a concrete frame. You don't have to rebuild it. You don't have to do the groundwork. You don't have to do a huge amount of work. So I think that perception of value has shifted.
And speaking of our specific context here in Toronto, a lot of the sites that are deemed heritage are in intensely urban areas that are urbanizing at extremely high densities. And so what we end up with are 2 or 3 story kind of, Edwardian era or Victorian era buildings where they're deemed heritage and need to be retained on, posted stamp size sites where, the quote unquote highest and best use is a 50 or 60 story residential or mixed use tower. So there's really no way of successfully mimicking what's existing. And it is a very strong juxtaposition, which is actually quite interesting. And it creates this kind of composition of heritage buildings at the base that still inform the pedestrian experience, but very kind of sleek, high density towers above it that emerge and inform the skyline. So it's a really kind of interesting phenomenon that we're seeing, at least here locally.
Yeah. So that's interesting again, as a different setting and a different set of drivers creating a particular solution. Well, thank you all. I think we're coming to the end of our time. Thank you for your insights, Dev, Bruce, and Mike. I'm off to look at some images of the building you've described, and I'm sure those listening will want to as well. So until the next time, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.